Now, today we're going to begin a new sermon series called Building a Life of Wisdom. And what we want to do today is we want to use the text that Natalia read to lay a firm foundation for that life. And the way that we want to do that is we want to do it by asking some questions. We want to ask 4 questions. First, we want to ask, what is wisdom literature? And when we're asking that question, what we're kind of doing is just laying the sort of foundation for reading these Proverbs. What are these crazy things? Why are they in our Bible? And then secondly, we want to ask, well, okay, we know what wisdom literature is now. What is wisdom? And then third, we want to ask, why should we want wisdom? And then we'll close with a brief description of where are we going from here. So let's begin by just talking about what is wisdom literature. Now, scholars have done lots of work in this area, kind of trying to explain to people what wisdom literature is. The ancients divided the Old Testament into 3 parts: the law, the prophets, and the writings. And most of the writings are what we would call, broadly speaking, wisdom literature. Now, the best way to understand what wisdom literature is simply to compare it to the law and the prophets. Now, the law records God's instructions to Israel when he constituted the 12 tribes into a nation. It functions like, well, a constitution. The prophets record God's messages to Israel in the midst of an often dark and complex history. And in both of these cases, it's not just the legal material itself or the prophetic material itself that's included in this designation of law or prophets. It's all the surrounding material that puts these instructions or these messages into their historical context. So, in the classic description, Genesis is considered law, even though there's basically no law in it from a genre point of view. It's all story. But it's the story that puts the legal material in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers into context. The same thing with the prophets. The way that the Hebrew Bible is divided for our Jewish friends, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, that's in the prophets. You're like, wait a minute, those aren't prophets. No, but they put the prophets in their context. Now, the wisdom literature is something different. The wisdom literature records Israel's reflections. Reflections on what? Well, Israel's reflections, first of all, on God's instructions and messages. It's the place where Israel's sages talk about the thinking and feeling and wrestling that they do as they work through these various instructions and messages they've received from God. It also records Israel's reflections upon the natural world and upon humanity. So sometimes the sages would just sit around and observe and think about what they observed. And we have that a lot in Psalms and Proverbs and other books too, Ecclesiastes, Job. So. And the wisdom literature records Israel's reflections on the individual and corporate experiences that make up Israel's history. So these guys, maybe even some gals too, but mostly guys, would sit around and they would think about, what does this all mean? What are these really good things that have happened to me, or these really horrible things that have happened to me? What do they mean? They would do theology. But they didn't do it like Greeks did. The Greeks tried to sit down and work things out in real logical ways. That's not how any of this works. It's a different way of thinking through the problems, but it's thinking through the problems all the same. So this is what the wisdom literature does. And the wisdom literature throughout all of these different books that we consider to be wisdom literature in the broad sense of the term, they all encourage us to seek wisdom. That's what our text does. Our text is really a prologue to Proverbs, and it may have been written long after Solomon. But it's a prologue that says, okay, this is what these collected sayings are about. They are about leading you to wisdom. And you should want wisdom. But what is wisdom? What is wisdom? What are we talking about here? Proverbs uses a wide variety of language to describe what it is that we're supposed to seek. It uses words like, of course, wisdom, but also knowledge and understanding and insight and prudence and discretion. Those are just the English words I picked out. There are even more as you look through the book of Proverbs. And sometimes preachers will try to differentiate exactly how, well, wisdom is different from knowledge this way. Knowledge is different from understanding this way. But I actually don't think that's the most helpful way to do this. Because while these are distinct terms, they also overlap with one another. And I won't get into all the reasons why we know that that's the case, but the way that these Proverbs are written, and Psalms are written the same way. The way that these Proverbs are written, we know that this language, that these terms are all related to each other. That's why I put a Venn diagram up here on your screen. It's because what I want you to see is that all of these terms work together to construct this thing we call wisdom. This thing that we're supposed to see. This thing that we're supposed to want. And so when we see all of those things put together, what we realize is, oh, wisdom is a much bigger thing than I thought it was. Okay? And I've got 6 things on that next slide that show us kind of what wisdom is. Yes, wisdom does actually include the acquisition and understanding of conceptual and theoretical knowledge, or theoretical information. I want to avoid that word knowledge because it's one of our words here. This is what we traditionally think of as knowledge. The actual Hebrew word that we translate knowledge has a little different flavor. But this is what we think of when we think of knowledge. But wisdom also includes the ability to apply that conceptual and theoretical information to practical and especially relational circumstances. So think about it this way. Imagine that you go to University of Texas at Arlington. They have a nice engineering program. Or maybe you go to Texas A&M or someplace like that. And you get an engineering degree, right? And you can do all the mathematical formulas and stuff, but you have a really hard time using that information in the real world. The ancients would say that you haven't yet arrived at wisdom. Likewise, let's say that you go there and you get your engineering degree, but the truth is you nearly flunked every class that you took because you didn't actually learn anything. Well, you're not at wisdom yet either. Wisdom is the gal or the guy who goes to school, gets their engineering degree, comes back to Ranger, and they can look and tell you which buildings are sound and which buildings are not, even when those buildings look sound or don't look sound to other people. They're able to take their head knowledge, we like to call it, and apply it to the real world. That's wisdom. And like I said before, it especially applies in relational settings. They're able to take the things that they've learned and use those things to help other people, to relate to other people, to have healthy interactions with other people, to help their community flourish. That's wisdom. But wisdom is also the ability to see beyond superficial impressions of people, situations, topics. We might call that insight. Wisdom is also the ability to control one's own desires and emotions. Yes, there is actually an emotional or psychological component to wisdom. And it's weird. We see this over and over again in the Proverbs, how wise and prudent and thoughtful and understanding people are described as people who have mastered themselves. Wisdom is also the ability and the willingness to subordinate one's own judgments about how things ought to be done, all that kind of thing, to the judgments of people who are wiser and stronger. Now, we get the whole, why it would be wise to subject one's own thoughts about a situation to someone who's wiser. They know more than you. But why stronger? Well, let's use the example that Proverbs will use later in the book. So let's say you're an advisor to a king. And the king seems to be bent on doing something that's really boneheaded, right? Maybe that's not even really that moral. It's kind of not a good thing to do. And you lay all your chips on the table and just be like, no, king, you can't do this. This is not good. The point that Proverbs wants to make is, if you lose your head in that argument, you won't be there to influence the king later. And someone with less moral scruples or less wisdom will take your place. Wisdom is patient. Now, this is a little bit of a hard one for us as New Testament people, because we understand that there are times you just got to lay it on the line. You just got to throw down your credentials, and if they fire you, they fire you. If they behead you, they behead you. And there's something to be said for that too. But there is also something to be said for the kind of wisdom that lives to fight another day. And then wisdom makes decisions in light of the best available information. And then it acts on those decisions. And I got to be honest with you. COVID-19 has exposed how too many churches are unwilling to act in wise ways. They don't have mastery of themselves. They're, to paraphrase a line from a movie, they're mad as heck and they're not going to take it anymore. And that's how they're acting. But those of you who've been around church life a long time, you know that that lack of wisdom didn't start with COVID-19. We as Christians have a bad habit of not making decisions in light of the best available information. The opposite of that is wisdom. Wisdom makes decisions in light of the best available information. And if I might extend the thinking of Proverbs a little bit, wisdom is also willing to change its mind when new information comes available. Wisdom always seeks more wisdom. Now, as we look at that list, there's a couple, one or two anyway, things that kind of emerge from that list. The first is that wisdom is not merely a matter of the head. It is a matter of the heart and the hands as well. You can't claim to be wise unless you live wisely. That's the point. And the second is this, and this might be a little controversial, but I think it's important for us to remember, as long as we don't overemphasize it. Yes, wisdom has a distinctively moral component, and we're going to come back to that in just a minute. But wisdom realizes that there is more to life than just morality. There are other concerns that have to be considered. Of course, one of those concerns is not just, is this the right thing to do, but how is this going to affect the group? Remember, wisdom really flourishes, really comes into its own in relational contexts. Now, sometimes those relational contexts are formal, like a judicial proceeding. Sometimes they're informal. But what happens is we take all the knowledge that God has given us and we use that knowledge for the benefit of those around us, for the benefit of the institutions and structures that help us and the people around us live and flourish. That's what wisdom does. And really, that leads us quite nicely into our next question. Why should we want wisdom? Because to be honest, to some people, they see that list of things that wisdom is, and they kind of go, that doesn't sound like any fun. I don't want to do any of that. It's work. Well, yes, wisdom is work. So why would you want to do that? Why would you want to put in the work to be wise? Well, the first two reasons are related to one another. First of all, wisdom protects us from the harm that just kind of naturally comes to lazy, simple, and foolish people. Now, those are three categories that I'm drawing directly from Proverbs. If you've read a lot of Proverbs, you've seen that kind of language. And we know what a lazy person is. They just don't like to work. I confess, I'm a little bit guilty as charged here. There's a lot of us who don't like to work, but we do it anyway, right? The lazy person, they don't do it anyway. The simple person, that's not necessarily somebody who's morally deficient. They just, as we like to say in the South sometimes, they just ain't got no sense. You've known these people. They're nice, good old boys, you know, but they always seem to be in trouble. And you find out why they're in trouble, and you just go, didn't you have the good sense to not do that? And the answer is always no. I had a friend in college, love him to death, but he comes in one night at 3:45 in the morning, and he'd been out with his girlfriend, and after he took her home, he was still bored. So he decided that it would be a good idea to climb the tower of the little airport that was at the end of our campus. At 3:15 in the morning. Now, the good news is he didn't fall off. He didn't hurt himself. When he got about halfway up the tower, and the Walnut Ridge police officer and the airport security guard, who were sitting there talking to each other, turned the spotlight on him. Somehow he had managed not to see the police car sitting there. The next day, he was in the vice president for student affairs office, and she was asking him if he was thinking about committing suicide. And he was just like, what is wrong with you? No, I was just bored. That was an example of being simple. And of course, that was pre-9/11, so he didn't end up in federal prison. Now, that was kind of a harmless simpleness. But sometimes being simple isn't so harmless. And then there are people who are foolish. And these are the people who do have a moral deficiency. And specifically, that moral deficiency is often a disregard for the wisdom of the community. A disregard for, hey, this is the way we do things because we found that this is really the best way to do it. And they're just kind of like, yeah. Now, you might be kind of saying, well, yeah, but we don't live in that kind of culture. We value the individual. Yes, we do. We make heroes out of people who go their own way. And while that's great for entrepreneurial leadership, to be honest, it's oftentimes not very good in real life. Especially in the moral life. Secondly, wisdom brings prosperity and productivity to our lives. Wisdom just helps us live better. Now that I've kind of talked about these first two benefits, we do need to acknowledge one big caveat. And it's a big caveat that the wisdom literature talks about a lot. Think about, for example, the first half of Psalm 10. We all know foolish people who have prospered. And we know wise people, or at least good people, who have not flourished. We know that those things exist. And the wisdom literature talks about that and wrestles with it. Frankly, struggles with it at times. But I think if we look back in our own lives, we will see that while you can't just say, well, if you're wise, you'll be rich and you won't face any harm. And if you're foolish, you're going to be dirt poor all the time. We can't say that. What we can say is that whatever station in life you're in, you will be better off if you live in accordance with wisdom, especially wisdom as we've defined it, than you will if you don't. My wife and I experience this every day. We don't make a lot of money. We really don't. There are people in our apartment complex who make 50% more than we do, 75% more than we do, twice as much as we do. And yet, sometimes I look around and I think, wow, we really do live better than some of them. Why? Some of it, of course, is God's blessing. Blessing we don't deserve, but some of it is that part of that blessing is living wisely. We don't burn $30 a week on cigarettes or more. We don't, and I don't mean to, because if you're addicted to cigarette smoking, that's a hard habit to kick. Let me just tell you, it is. But you have to admit that it is a little bit like rolling up $1 bills and lighting them on fire. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about. And this is another great example. We're not always making moral judgments. A lot of times it's just, that's really not a wise way to spend your money or to live your life or to do whatever, That's kind of what we're talking about here. Third benefit that wisdom gives us is that it helps us to do what is right and just and fair. Notice the quotation marks there, directly from our passage. And I told you we'd come back to this question of the connection between morality and wisdom. You can't be wise if you don't have an acute moral sensitivity, because wisdom is about doing what's right. But notice that he doesn't stop at what's right. He talks about what's just and what is fair. Of course, remember, this is the NIV. Other translations may render it a little differently. You don't see that reference to fairness very often in the Old Testament. It's there, but it's not very often. But what the writer of Proverbs is trying to do, or the compiler or editor, whoever it is that has put together this prologue for us, what he's trying to do is he's trying to remind us that the moral life itself is complex. It can be challenging sometimes to know what we should do, what really is the best thing for us, for our community, for the people that we love, for the people who've been harmed. I mean, the truth is, folks, that you start really diving into some of these complex social issues, like race and policing. And what you will find is there's a lot of people who've got a lot of really good points. Even people with whom you might really pretty strongly disagree about some things, or maybe even a lot of things. But they got at least a piece of the truth. And you go, oh, okay, how do I make this fit with this other piece that I know over here, and then this other piece that I have back here, and then that's what wisdom lets us do. Because wisdom is, remember what we've been saying all along, wisdom is not just this one thing. It's this whole way of looking at life. It's this whole way of interacting with knowledge. It's this whole way of regulating ourselves that helps us to see the world differently and better. So these are really good benefits. I don't know about you, but I'd actually like to live a more prosperous and productive life. And I'm really allergic to pain. So, living a life that avoids the harm that comes to lazy and simple and foolish people, that's a really good thing for me. And yes, I do want to have that ability to think in complex ways and in accurate ways about the moral challenges of our lives. But the Proverbs insist, particularly in chapters 1 through 9, that wisdom is valuable in and of itself. Why? For one thing, because it connects us with the mind of God. Over and over again, the Proverbs tell us that it is by wisdom that God created the universe. And if you ever hear Francis Collins, who's the head of the National Institutes of Health, was instrumental in the whole Human Genome Project. Extremely intelligent man. Talk about all the biochemical and physical properties that have to be exactly calibrated for the universe to exist the way that it does and for life on Earth to exist the way that it does. It'll make your head explode. And Dr. Collins is a Christian. And you just hear him talk about this and you're like, okay, yes, I think I need to shut up now. I feel like Job. I know nothing. That's the wisdom that God used to create this universe. And when we pursue wisdom, we are connecting with the mind of God. But wisdom is also valuable for its own sake because it transforms us into a better version of who we are. Now, it's not the same kind of transformation that comes through God's Spirit. But it is a change nonetheless, and a change for the better. And by the way, wisdom is the tool that God's Spirit, or at least one of the tools, it's not the only tool, but it is one of the tools that God's Spirit uses to change us, to bring about that more comprehensive transformation that can only come in Christ. So wisdom is a valuable commodity. And it's worth investing some time and some effort into. So where are we going from here? Well, we're going to talk some more about building a life of wisdom. And we're going to do this over the next 6 weeks, we hope. And we're going to do it along the lines of what I've called these 6 pillars of wisdom. Now, I'm taking this out of Proverbs 3, 1 through 12. It's a very interesting text. Proverbs doesn't really have a whole lot of structure But chapters 1 through 9 kind of do. And part of that structure points us to 3:1 through 12 as being particularly important in how Solomon and the other sages of Israel thought about this thing we call wisdom. And here's what we're going to do. Each week we're going to take one of these pillars and look at it in detail and see how these 6 pillars help us to build a life of wisdom. And it's really interesting. Most of them are not going to deal directly with our logic. They'll do that indirectly, but they're not going to deal with it directly. They're going to work on our heart. Because, or in modern neurobiological terms, the right side of our brain. Because if they can get that squared away, even 3,000 years ago, the proverbialists understood, if you can get that squared away, if you can get that devoted to God and directed in the right direction, everything else will follow. But if you don't get that squared away, if you don't get the heart right, nothing else matters. So that's what we're going to do over the next several weeks. Let us pray. Father in heaven, we are committing ourselves